Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. And we have with us to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to explain the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, the Executive Director of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, Ms. Amber Gooding. And of course, Ms. Gooding, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
I wanted to tell you how delighted we are to have you, Ms. Gooding, and to also remind our audience that this is a celebration of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is to say that we've planned several shows around this very, very important act of 1964. And I think that your agency, the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, in a real sense came out of the activities dealing with that particular act. But before we get into that, Ms. Gooding, let's have you to give our audience some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important that eventually led you to the executive directorship of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission on the state level. And then we'll talk about some other things dealing with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission and the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you for having me. I am a native Memphian, but actually I was born here in Nashville, Tennessee, back in the early 60s. And grew up in Memphis and attended school there. Actually came here to Fisk University and attended college here for a couple of years. Unfortunately, was here during a time where the school was in a lot of financial trouble, but finished college at Christian Brothers University in Memphis with a degree in economics and finance. And from there found myself working in healthcare and business development. Family-wise along the way, really always was involved and grew up in a family that was very active in the civil rights movement and organization throughout Memphis. My uncle is Benjamin Hooks, who's the executive director of the NAACP, and growing up in that family was always immersed in a number of sit-ins and things like that, and organizations and so forth, in dealing with civil rights. And so as a little girl, I was very much impressed and surrounded by that kind of activity. Never thought that necessarily that being a little girl that I would grow up to become the executive director of a civil rights organization. But I think what I did grow up with was a keen sense and a family that was very committed to service and to helping. My father was a physician, my mother a psychologist with the school system, and always worked with underserved children. And so it's with that in many of the job capacities I've had in healthcare was that in mind in working with people who needed help. So some years after spending in Memphis, found myself about 6 years ago being asked to come to Nashville to work on a special neighborhood development under the Sunquist administration, and pursued that and working with Human Services. And then in change of administration was asked to consider coming on board with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. And so it was definitely one that I was very interested in, had expressed an interest, because again, back to some of the same roots, and that's helping people who need help.
You know, one of the things in reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Ms. Gooding, as you well know, is that it created a number of organizations, and I think the Tennessee Human Rights Commission also grew out of that. Let's talk about the specific relationship between that act and the Tennessee Human Rights Commission.
Well, very good question. Actually, our statute for the Tennessee Human Rights Commission mirrors that very closely of the federal law, and in fact, what it's called many times is having substantial equivalency. The state of Tennessee, along with the state of Kentucky and several other southern states at that time, were working on having state law to mirror that of the federal law, because the federal government had seen to it to finally to go ahead and put these protected classes of discrimination against race, creed, color, religion into law. And so it took states also needing to enact something very similar so that people could be protected, not only on a federal level, but on a state level. That would keep them from always having to go to federal court and so forth. And so with that in mind, Tennessee has what is considered a substantial equivalency. There are a few differences, and I'd be glad to, to discuss those. For instance, under the employment section, for instance, under federal law, an employer has to have 15 more employees before to qualify for somebody to be able to file a complaint. In Tennessee law, it only has to be 8 or more. So in fact, our threshold is lower,
much lower,
and therefore provides more protection for somebody living here in Tennessee than the federal law does.
Let's hold that thought, and we'll talk about those other exceptions, Ms. Gooden, as soon as we come back after this first commercial break. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Temperatures are rising and Nashville nights are.
The topic is the civil rights